Next up, we have Dallas Pillen. He's going to be presenting supporting internal workflows with plugins at the Bentley Historical Library. Dallas is the archivist for metadata and digital curation at the Bentley Historical Library, where he oversees the library's use of ArchivesSpace, Archivematica, DSpace, and ArchiveIt. He is also an adjunct lecturer in information at the University of Michigan School of Information, a member of the ArchivesSpace Technical Advisory Council, and co-chair of the SAA Encoded Archival Standards section. Dallas's professional interests and activities are generally related to metadata creation, transformation and reuse, digital preservation, and access. Dallas?
All right, so yeah, as Jessica said, I'm Dallas, the archivist for metadata and digital curation at the Bentley Historical Library. A little bit of context for my presentation. I'm talking about some of the plugins that we use at the Bentley to support our implementation of ArchivesSpace, sort of in interest of some of the later presentations that are sort of show and tells about plugins, or maybe more technical workshops about how some of the technical back-end aspects of ArchivesSpace work. I'm not actually going to be giving a demonstration of many plugins or talking about how they work behind the scenes or the development of them. I wanted to share some of our experiences in when we were implementing ArchivesSpace, some of the local needs that we identified that were maybe not supported out of the box by the system, how we identified those and how we went about sort of supporting those at the library to make our implementation more of a success. So why focus on specifically internal workflows? ArchivesSpace out of the box does a lot for us. I think everyone here who's using ArchivesSpace probably understands a lot of what it does just out of the box with supporting accessioning, resource creation, container management, default reporting. So ArchivesSpace already supports a lot of best practices and community standards and does 95% of what we need it to do just right out of the box. Aside from ArchivesSpace proper, the ArchivesSpace community, all of you also do a lot. The Staff Interface Enhancement Working Group, Public User Interface Enhancement Project, Development Priorities, local institutions who are creating plugins to share back with the community that make it into the core code, institutions who are working on systems integration, the user and technical advisory councils are constantly making ArchivesSpace better for everyone. There are constantly improvements that are being made and ways to make ideas that you might have about how to make ArchivesSpace better actually make it into the program. And yet, all of those sort of generalizable community best practices, improvements to ArchivesSpace, we found have not been able to support all of our local needs, have not been able to convince everyone at our institution that ArchivesSpace is easy to use and does all of what we need it to do. During implementation, we identified several needs and have identified several since then based on a series of user interviews that we conducted with pretty much everyone in the library who would be using ArchivesSpace. We asked them sort of what their workflows are, how they do their jobs, what they need out of a collection management system, and we turned those results into some user stories, which is what I'll be sharing today, and then we evaluated whether or not those were supported by some default application functionality or some community-supported enhancements, or if we'd have to make some local modifications to support those needs. The why plugins specifically. ArchivesSpace, if you're not familiar, has a robust plugin architecture. Plugins can be used to modify most aspects of the application. And an important thing for us is that those modifications can benefit all users regardless of technical ability or system-specific expertise. So you'll also be hearing today about things like the ArchivesSpace API, which is also very powerful and can be used to sort of make the application work better for you and your local institution, but it does require some additional specialized knowledge and technical ability, whereas plugins can change sort of the exports and imports of the application, can change the interface, can change reporting. It can touch most aspects of the application in a way that allows everyone to take advantage of those local modifications. Some important caveats about using plugins to support a lot of local practices is that plugin development itself requires some specialized knowledge and technical ability. It does require actually developing the plugins or having the resources to pay somebody to develop them for you. There's always a chance that new ArchivesSpace releases might be incompatible with existing plugins, in which case you would need to either update those plugins or get rid of them or get stuck on an older version of ArchivesSpace. So you always want to sort of be aware of sort of the sustainability implications. I will say that if possible, the best practice would be to adopt local practice to match the default functionality of the application and use plugins for small, specific, non-critical functionality, which I think is what we're mostly using plugins for, is to do one thing that if we had to get rid of it, we could probably live with it. So the process that we used, as I said, for identifying and supporting local needs was conducting user interviews with all staff who would be using the application and trying to decide what was the best way to support those needs. One sort of need that we heard about a lot was there were a lot of people at our institution who needed to be able to know what the donor number is. This is a very local practice that we use for sort of assigning a unique identifier to every donor of materials to the archive. It's what we use to manage our physical donor files. It's sort of how a lot of people at the institution find correspondence, deeds of gifts, things like that. And it's something that our legacy accession management system had, and it was actually one of the reasons why in the past we never migrated to something like Archivist Toolkit, was because at the time just could not figure out a way to maintain this like very locally specific important identifier. So our collections managers and processing archivists and our sort of development officers all in these user interviews expressed a need to be able to know some of these very important local identifiers within the application. Out of the box, ArchivesSpace has, a robust agent management system for sort of managing the, Library of Congress form of names with, authority IDs and sources and all sorts of important things like that. But there was not a clear field to us where we could sort of throw in this local identifier. So this is where one of our earliest plugins came about, which was just a plugin to add some simple unique identifiers to the agent details section of ArchivesSpace. It actually adds 3 unique identifiers for everyone. Our agents have a lot of unique identifiers. And this is actually one of the plugins that it's the only one we use that does anything to like change or modify the ArchivesSpace data model. That's also something that is a caveat that I should have added, that this adds a couple of extra fields to the database, which is like a little bit scarier, but it was something that we sort of had to support locally. So now we have an extra section in our agent records where we can add these locally important fields. Another need that people brought up a lot when we were testing and implementing the application was people didn't really like the staff interface search functionality, particularly for searching for accession records, the system we were using before. People liked a lot better. It showed a lot more information about an accession when you were searching. And people really wanted to be able to view specific fields in an accession record when they were conducting a search. You might be familiar that this is sort of out of the box what a search looks like against all of your accessions. It maybe shows a title, an identifier, but there's a lot of valuable information that you sort of have to click into each record to be able to see. So in order for sort of our collection managers, field archivists, who that would have been like a lot of extra steps just to find the one record that they were looking for. So we developed a sort of local search interface modification. It just changes the way that accession search results looks to add a couple of locally identified important fields that people really wanted to know every time they searched against our accessions, to be able to easily identify things like who donated to the accession, what collecting area is it from, what's the extent, if there's any description, if it's in the backlog or if it's been processed, things like that. So we identified this need to be able to get more detail about accessions, further identified what people wanted to know, and then this just adds an overlay to an accession search result to display more of that information. We also identified a need to be able to know who was ultimately responsible for, like the field archivist responsible for accessioning or transferring materials. Oftentimes, the person who is responsible for doing that is not the sort of creator of the accession record. In the past, we used like a staff received field in our old system that was sort of a free text, uncontrolled field. So it made sort of reporting on that really difficult. And this is something where actually the functionality that we needed was supported out of the box by ArchivesSpace. We decided to use an ArchivesSpace event record linking to that field archivist's controlled agent name in ArchivesSpace. And when we started sharing this with people, they were on board with the idea, but they expressed a desire to make that a little bit easier. It was something that seemed a little daunting every time you create an accession record to have to remember to create an event record and then link your agent name, and people just figured that it was less likely that it would happen in the consistent way that it needed to be to make it effective. So we actually adapted, there was an existing plugin developed by Hudson Malanglo, one of the first development partners of ArchivesSpace, that automatically creates some configured events when a new accession record is created. So we're using out-of-the-box functionality, but in a way that makes it a little bit easier so that people can consistently follow our guidelines and enter the information correctly. Along those lines, there was just a constant need identified that people wanted to be able to know that they were entering all of the required, locally preferred, and optional information in the way specified by our guidelines. You all may know that ArchivesSpace has sort of a lot of fields, particularly for accession records, that maybe we're not all using. Maybe we mean certain things by certain fields. We've identified local guidelines for how to use them, and people really wanted to make sure that they weren't just entering too much information, not enough information, using the incorrect fields. So we modified field names and tooltips to basically just copy and paste pieces of our documentation into the tooltips supplied by ArchivesSpace, so that, in this case, an access restrictions note, it sort of gives an overview of some of the common access restrictions that we add based on university policy, so people can just sort of reference that and even just copy and paste if they need to. We also made another modification of a Hudson Malanglo plugin that moves some user-defined fields just up in the accession record. There were a couple of things where we just couldn't fit the information into one of the default ArchivesSpace fields, so we're using some user-defined fields, but again, people sort of expressed this thought that if it's all the way down at the bottom of the accession record, it's sort of hidden, might not be able to, they want to be able to see them a little bit easier. So these just bump those results up into the user-defined field, and then we also made some unused fields read-only. So we migrated some legacy fields to some of these user-defined fields, but we didn't want people to use them in the same way we had historically used them. So we made them read-only so that information's there, but can't be edited. You can't use it in that same way anymore. And finally, everything I've talked about so far has been with our accession records, but we have made some modifications to how we create our metadata in some resource records, including a plugin that just automatically generates some of the text of a conditions governing access note using the sort of local restriction type and restriction end dates to, again, match some of the local specifications that we have that just make sure that the information is entered correctly and consistently in a way that works with our access system. And then the final local need that was identified were a lot of needs around reporting. A lot of people needed to report on accessions, what's in the backlog, who donated stuff, how much stuff has been donated, and out of the box, again, ArchivesSpace has a lot of default reports, but we used a plugin to make a lot of sort of custom reports that generate the information that we need in particular. So rather than using some default reports and having to do a lot of filtering and cleaning them up, ArchivesSpace, you can use a plugin to create some local reports that give you exactly the information you need. We have a couple of other plugins that I just sort of wanted to list on here. We're using sort of a lot of plugins. You may have noticed that but we also have a lot of justifications, maybe also a lot of hubris, but we've sort of identified a lot of specific local needs. Most of the plugins we're using do one small specific thing. They're not supporting, in most cases, critical functionality or, other than one plugin, modifying the data model, but generally just make the application easier to use for staff so that we can have a successful implementation of ArchivesSpace and make sure that everyone's using it consistently, and that some of the things that might have been more tedious or confusing about the application are just made a little bit easier. And the one final thought I'll leave is just to make sure if you are using plugins, it's important to document what they're what are being used, how they work, and if they modify any aspects of the core application, which those are. So it makes troubleshooting and migration a little bit easier. And that's all I've got.